She walked 3 miles in summer heat to marry a man who didn't love her, and she brought wildflowers to her own wedding because no one else would. Amelia Carter had nothing, no money, no family, no future. Only a dead brother's name and the soldier who had watched him die. Nathaniel Whitaker came to her door with a debt, not a heart. She accepted, not out of desperation, but out of a dignity so fierce it would change everything. If a woman who refused to break already has you feeling something, subscribe now, drop your city in the comments, and stay until the very end. This story travels further than you think. Virginia had never been gentle to the Carter family. Even in summer, when the land bloomed green and heavy with honeysuckle, and the Blue Ridge Mountains shimmered like something painted by a man with too much hope, the county's generosity stopped well short of a dead minister's door. People in Hargrove County knew exactly what to give a family like the Carters, just enough pity to feel righteous, and not 1 grain more. Amelia Carter had buried her mother at 16, her father at 22, and her brother Thomas at 26. She was 27 now, and she was still standing. That fact alone seemed to irritate half the county. She rose before the sun on the morning everything changed, same as she did every morning. She fed the 2 chickens she still owned. She checked the garden, pulled 3 sorry-looking carrots from the dry ground, and boiled water over a fire she'd built herself because there was no one else left to build it. She ate standing up, the way women who live alone learn to do quickly, without ceremony, without pretending the meal was anything but fuel. Then she heard boots on the porch. She didn't flinch. She set her cup down with careful precision, smoothed her apron with both hands, and walked to the door. She'd been expecting the banksman for 3 weeks. What she had not been expecting was Nathaniel Whitaker. He stood on her porch like he'd been carved out of something that didn't bend. 6 feet of broad shoulders and jaw-set silence, hat in his hands, dark eyes scanning her face with an expression she couldn't read. He wore a coat too fine for this part of the county, boots too clean for a man who'd ridden through the summer dust without a purpose. He had a purpose. She could feel it before he said a word. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was low, measured. The kind of voice that had given orders on a battlefield and expected them to be followed. "Mr. Whitaker." She did not step back. She did not invite him in. "I wasn't expecting you, no," he said. "I don't reckon you were." A beat of silence stretched between them, thick as August heat. "Thomas talked about you," she said finally. Not a greeting. A statement. A small, deliberate reminder that she knew exactly who this man was and exactly what he represented, the last person to see her brother alive. Something crossed Nathaniel's face. Not guilt exactly. Something older and harder than guilt. Something that had been living in him long enough to put down roots. "He talked about you too," Nathaniel said. She waited. "Every day," he said. "For 2 years. On every march, every camp, every night we spent wondering whether morning would come. Thomas talked about you, Miss Carter, like you were the one thing in this world worth coming home to." Her throat tightened. She had been preparing herself for 3 weeks of creditors and pity and the slow, grinding arithmetic of a woman with no money, no family, and no prospects. She had not been prepared for this. "He came home in a box," she said, and her voice was steady because she had made it steady, because she had used up her unsteady days long ago. "Whatever he said about me didn't keep him alive." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "No, it didn't. So what brings you to my door, Mr. Whitaker? Because I know it isn't condolences. Those were due 8 months ago." He didn't flinch at that. She gave him credit for it. "I heard about the debts," he said. "Everyone's heard about the debts. Half this county has been watching my front door waiting to see how long I last." She tilted her head. "Is that why you're here, to watch?" "No, ma'am." "Then say what you came to say." He put his hat back on, which struck her as a strange thing to do mid-conversation, and then he looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes, and he said, "I made your brother a promise." The words landed like a stone in still water. She said nothing. The night he died, Nathaniel continued. Thomas made me swear I wouldn't leave you without protection. That was his word. Protection. His jaw moved. I've spent 8 months trying to figure out what that looks like without insulting you. Amelia let out a breath that was almost a laugh. And what did you decide? I decided to ask you to marry me. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them looked away. That's not a proposal, she said finally. That's a transaction. Yes, ma'am, it is. He didn't pretend otherwise. She noticed that. I won't dress it up in language it doesn't deserve. You're in debt. The bank will take this property inside the month. You have no family, no suitors, and no other options that don't involve the charity of people who've already shown you exactly how much they think you're worth. His voice didn't waver. I have a house, a functioning property, and a promise I haven't kept. If you marry me, the debts disappear. The house is yours to live in. You'll want for nothing material. And what do you want? She asked. To keep my word to a dead man. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another man might have shifted his weight, or looked away, or offered something softer, something more palatable. Nathaniel Whitaker did not shift, did not soften. She respected that even though she didn't want to. I don't want your pity, she said at last. It isn't pity, he said. It's a debt. She absorbed that. There was something almost dignified in the honesty of it, the absence of false warmth, the refusal to perform a tenderness neither of them felt. He was not pretending to love her. He was not pretending this was anything other than what it was. And there was something in that bare-faced truth that felt, strangely, more respectful than anything the county's good Christian women had offered her in 8 months of casseroles and sideways glances. I'll think on it, she said. The bank comes Friday, he said. I'll need an answer before then. He turned to go. Mr. Whitaker. He stopped. Did he suffer, she asked. And though her voice remained steady, her hands pressed flat against her apron, and she pressed hard. At the end, did he suffer? Nathaniel turned to face her. And for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, the armor cracked and she saw what lived underneath it. Not a powerful man, not a decorated officer, just someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. No, he said. It was fast. And my name was the last thing he said before yours. She nodded once, a single controlled dip of her head. I'll have your answer by Thursday, she said. She gave him her answer Wednesday. She walked the 3 miles to Whitaker Farm herself on foot, in the summer heat, because she would not send a note like a woman who needed to hide behind paper, and she would not wait to be collected, like a parcel. When she arrived, dusty and sweat-dampened and entirely unapologetic about both, the housekeeper, a broad, efficient woman named Mrs. Elmore, who clearly had opinions about everything, nearly fell over herself getting Amelia to a chair and a glass of water. Amelia declined the chair. Nathaniel appeared from the back of the house, coatless, sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking like he'd been doing something with his hands rather than sitting in judgment of things. That surprised her slightly. Rich men in her experience did not tend to dirty their hands. But his were dirty. Calloused, too, she noticed when he reached out to take the hat from Mrs. Elmore, who was hovering like a nervous sparrow. Miss Carter, he said. I accept your offer, she said, on 2 conditions. He studied her. Go ahead first. I will not be a decoration. I will work. Whatever needs doing on this property that a woman can do, I will do. I will not sit in a parlor and pretend to embroider while things that need fixing go unfixed. A pause, second. She met his eyes directly. You will not lie to me. Not the finances, not the state of the property, not your moods or intentions. I have had enough of men who thought protecting women meant keeping them in the dark. If we are to share a life, we share information. All of it. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. Something closer to recognition. Agreed, he said again. She nodded. Then we have a deal, Mr. Whitaker. She put out her hand. He looked at her just a second, long enough that she wondered if she'd done something wrong, transgressed some rule of propriety she hadn't known existed, and then he took it. His grip was firm and dry and brief. Thursday morning, he said. Judge Caldwell can perform the ceremony at the courthouse. Fine, she said. I'll bring my own flowers. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen anything crack that controlled expression. She turned before he could see the small, private satisfaction it gave her, and she walked back out into the summer heat. They married on a Thursday morning with no guests, no celebration, and no pretense. Amelia wore a white dress she'd made herself from fabric that had been her mother's. It wasn't fashionable, it wasn't elaborate. It was clean and well-sewn, and it fit her properly, which was more than she could say for most things in her life. She carried a small bunch of black-eyed Susans she'd cut from the roadside on the walk over, which caused Judge Caldwell's clerk to stare, and caused Nathaniel's expression to do that almost cracking thing again. The ceremony took 12 minutes. When Judge Caldwell pronounced them married, Amelia did not feel joy. She did not feel love. She felt the particular, bracing clarity of a woman who has made a hard decision and intends to live by it. She felt the weight of two conditions she had set and intended to enforce. She felt the strange, oblique comfort of having outmaneuvered a future that had been trying to crush her. Nathaniel helped her into the wagon that would take them to the farm. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Amelia said, "Tell me about the property." He looked at her sideways. "We just got married." "I know." "Tell me about the property." Another pause. And then so quietly she almost missed it. Something that might have been a single breath of something like amusement escaped him. 340 acres, he said. Tobacco and corn, mostly. Some livestock. The house is 7 rooms. The east field needs new drainage or we'll lose half the summer yield. A beat. The accounts are handled by my manager, a man named Garrett Pruitt, who's been with the farm since before my father died. Do you trust him? Nathaniel's voice didn't change. He's efficient. That's not what I asked. A longer pause this time. He's always kept good books. Amelia turned to look at him directly. Mr. Whitaker, do you trust him? Nathaniel met her gaze. I don't know, he said at last. I've had other things on my mind. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. Possibly the most honest thing he'd said in months. She could see from the slight flicker in his eyes that even he seemed surprised by it. Then that's where we start, she said, and turned back to face the road. Whitaker Farm was nothing like she'd imagined. She had expected the house of a wealthy man to feel powerful, assured. A statement of permanence. What she found instead was a house that had clearly been maintained out of habit, rather than love rooms that were clean but cold, furniture that was fine but arranged without any thought to living, a kitchen where Mrs. Elmore reigned with iron competence but quiet sadness. As if the house itself had forgotten, gradually, what it was supposed to be for. Her room was at the far end of the hall from his. This had been agreed upon separately, without discussion, the way people agree on things that are too awkward to actually say. She unpacked her 2 bags with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had never had the luxury of being sentimental about space. Then she went to find the accounts ledger. Mrs. Elmore found her in the study, standing over the desk with the ledger open in front of her. Ma'am, Mrs. Elmore said, in the tone of a woman who had strong feelings about new brides, and where they ought to be spending their first evening. Mrs. Elmore, Amelia said pleasantly, without looking up. How long have you worked for Mr. Whitaker? A pause. 12 years, ma'am. I worked for his father before him. And Mr. Pruitt, the manager? 7 years. The housekeeper's voice was careful now. Measuring. Does he come to the house often? Every Friday, ma'am. To go over the accounts with Mr. Whitaker. Does Mr. Whitaker look at the ledger himself, or does he take Mr. Pruitt's word for it? A very long pause, Mr. Pruitt, Mrs. Elmore said, which was not an answer to the question Amelia had asked. I see, Amelia said, and she went back to the ledger. She was still reading it an hour later when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked back at her. You said you'd work, he said. I am working. He stopped. Reconsidered. I meant something more like helping Mrs. Elmore with the household. I'm sure Mrs. Elmore manages the household beautifully without my interference. Amelia turned a page. Your drainage project in the East Field is going to cost you more than Mr. Pruitt has accounted for. He's estimated materials but hasn't factored in the labor for redirecting the creek bed. If you start in August, you'll miss the autumn planting window entirely. You should have started in May. Silence. And your tobacco yield from last season, she tapped the page, is listed here as 400 pounds per acre. But your workforce numbers from the previous page suggest you don't have enough hands to produce that. Either you have undocumented workers, or those numbers are wrong. She looked up at him. His expression had done something she hadn't seen before. It had gone very still, in the way of a man who has just heard something he can't dismiss, but very much wants to. Where did you learn to read accounts, he asked. My father was a minister, not a fool. He kept careful records of everything the parish owned and owed. I kept them after he lost his eyesight. She set the ledger down. Someone has been telling you what you want to hear, Mr. Whitaker. These numbers don't add up, and either Garrett Pruitt doesn't know that, or he does. Nathaniel walked into the room slowly. He stopped across the desk from her, and he looked down at the ledger with the expression of a man confronting something he had been avoiding for a long time. He started. Stopped. I haven't been paying close attention. No, she said without judgment, you haven't. He looked at her. You've been here 6 hours, 4.5, and I've found 3 discrepancies. There may be more. She held his gaze. You agreed to share information. I'm sharing information. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, show me. She showed him. They sat at that desk for 2 hours, side by side as the summer evening pressed dark against the windows. She walked him through every number she'd flagged, every inconsistency, every calculation that didn't balance. He asked sharp questions. She answered sharper ones. The language of ledgers and land and labor stripped away whatever strange awkwardness had been hovering over them since the courthouse, replaced by something cleaner and more functional, the honest engagement of 2 minds working on a real problem. At some point, Mrs. Elmore appeared with a tray of food and tea, looked at them both with an expression impossible to categorize, and retreated without a word. At 10 o'clock, Nathaniel sat back in his chair and rubbed the space between his eyes. I've been letting this go for almost a year, he said. I know, she said. He stopped. I've had other things occupying my attention. She thought of Thomas, of 8 months since the war ended, and what a man might do with himself when the thing that had structured his entire world had vanished overnight. She thought of what it looked like, from the inside, to be someone who kept going through the motions, because stopping felt like something he wasn't permitted to do. She said nothing. Sometimes silence was the more respectful response. I'll speak with Pruitt on Friday, Nathaniel said at last. Good. She stood. Don't tell him what you found until you've had the county auditor look at the original receipts. If Pruitt is honest, he'll welcome the audit. If he isn't, she paused, you'll want documentation. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Amelia, he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She waited. A pause. The word seemed to cost him something. Glad you came. She picked up the empty tea tray, Mrs. Elmore had left and headed for the door. Don't be glad yet, she said. We haven't found everything wrong with this place. She paused in the doorway and looked back at him. But we will. She left him sitting at the desk with the ledger open between his hands, and for the first time in 8 months, Nathaniel Whitaker did not go to bed thinking about Thomas Carter. He went to bed thinking about the woman down the hall who had walked 3 miles in summer heat to marry a stranger, brought black-eyed Susans to her own wedding, and spent her wedding evening dismantling a fraud that had been stealing from him for over a year. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and he thought, Thomas, what did you send me? Friday arrived the way bad things often do, sunny and ordinary, and giving no sign of what it intended. Garrett Pruitt came to the farm at 10 o'clock, as he always did, a compact, well-dressed man with close-set eyes, and the kind of easy smile that suggested he had used it successfully for a long time. He shook Nathaniel's hand, offered the new Mrs. Whitaker a brief, assessing nod, and settled into the chair across the desk as if the desk were his by right. Amelia sat in the corner of the room. She had not been invited, and she had not asked permission. She simply appeared with a small piece of mending, sat down, and began to sew with the serene concentration of a woman who had every right to be exactly where she was. Pruitt looked at her once, then at Nathaniel. I didn't realize the lady of the house would be joining us, he said, with the particular smile of a man who is not actually smiling. My wife has an interest in the farm's finances, Nathaniel said. His voice was entirely neutral. She'll be sitting in on all future account meetings. A beat. Of course, Pruitt said. He opened his account book. Amelia did not look up from her mending, but she heard every number, every explanation, every small, smooth adjustment Pruitt made to his language when a figure didn't quite match what Nathaniel had seen in the ledger. The graceful pivot, the cheerful reattribution, the seamless way he moved on before a question could fully form. He was good. She gave him that. He had been doing this long enough that it looked like competence. When Pruitt finished and closed his book, Nathaniel said, "One more thing." Pruitt looked up. "I've requested an audit from the county," Nathaniel said. "Standard procedure. They'll want the original receipts from the past 3 years." Something happened behind Pruitt's eyes, fast, barely visible. Like a candle flame in a closed room responding to a draft that shouldn't exist. "Of course," he said again. "Smother this time. I'll have everything prepared." He shook Nathaniel's hand, offered Amelia another small nod, this one slightly less warm, and left. The moment the door closed, Nathaniel looked at Amelia. She had set down her mending. He shifted the explanation for the Eastfield labor costs. 3 times in 4 minutes, she said. The second version contradicted the first, and the third contradicted both. "I caught that," Nathaniel said. "And when you mentioned the audit," he blinked 4 times in less than 2 seconds. She picked up her mending again. A confident man doesn't blink. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "How much do you think he's taken?" he asked. She looked up. "I'd estimate somewhere between 12 and 18% of your net annual revenue." "Over 3 years," she paused. "I could be wrong. The auditor will know better than I do." Nathaniel stood. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the fields. "I should have seen this," he said. "Yes," she said. Simply, without cruelty, he turned and looked at her over his shoulder. "You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. Would it help?" A silence. "No," he said, "it wouldn't." "Then I won't say it." She bit off a thread with her teeth. "What will help is doing what needs to be done next. Are you ready to do that?" He turned back to the window. Below, through the glass, she saw him watch Garrett Pruitt ride away down the long drive, and she watched the moment Nathaniel Whitaker made a decision. She could see it the way you can sometimes see the precise second a storm chooses its direction. Something in the set of his shoulders, the slow release of a breath he'd been holding. "Yes," he said, "I'm ready." She nodded once and went back to her mending. Outside, the Virginia summer burned on indifferent, brilliant, relentless the way it always had. The way it would continue to do, long after the secrets of Whitaker Farm were dragged into its light. But in that study something had changed, something small and almost invisible. 2 people who had entered a room as strangers bound by obligation had, without either of them quite noticing, begun to become something else entirely. The county auditor arrived on a Tuesday, which meant by Wednesday morning, every person within 12 miles of Hargrove County knew that Nathaniel Whitaker had called his own books into question. That was how it worked in small places. News didn't travel, it erupted. Amelia heard it first from Mrs. Elmore, who heard it from the boy who delivered flour, who had apparently heard it from someone at the feed store, who had heard it from someone whose cousin worked at the courthouse. By the time the story made its third or fourth hand, it had grown teeth. Some versions had Nathaniel on the verge of bankruptcy. Some had him accusing half the county of conspiracy. One version, the most creative, had Amelia herself as the source of the trouble, a scheming woman who had married a good man and immediately set about dismantling everything he'd built. She heard that version from the wife of one of Nathaniel's neighboring landowners, a thin-mouthed woman named Mrs. Beaumont, who delivered it with the particular sweetness of a person who believes cruelty is acceptable if it's wrapped in concern. People are worried about Nathaniel, of course, Mrs. Beaumont said, standing uninvited in Amelia's kitchen, having arrived under the guise of a welcome call with a basket of preserves nobody had asked for. He's been through such a great deal, losing Thomas the way he did. A man in that kind of grief is well vulnerable to influence. Amelia set the preserves aside without opening them. That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Beaumont. I only mean that people who've known Nathaniel for years, real friends of the family, want to be sure he's being looked after properly. He is, Amelia said, of course. The smile didn't waver. And I'm sure you mean well, dear. But stirring up questions about a man's accounts so soon after a marriage, it does make people wonder. Wonder what exactly? Mrs. Beaumont tilted her head with the practiced grace of a woman who had been delivering insults politely for decades. Whether the trouble started with the accounts, or whether it started at the altar. Amelia looked at her for a long, steady moment. Mrs. Beaumont, she said. The audit was Nathaniel's decision. The discrepancies were in the ledger before I arrived. And the man who put them there has been collecting a salary fee from this farm for 7 years. She picked up the basket of preserves and placed it gently in the woman's hands. Thank you for the visit. Mrs. Beaumont left. Amelia stood at the window and watched her go, and she pressed her hands flat on the windowsill and breathed through the part of her that wanted to say a great deal more. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment she put on that white dress and walked into the courthouse. A woman with nothing marrying a man with everything the county would have an opinion about that. The county always had an opinion. The question was never whether the opinions would come. The question was whether she intended to let them matter. She decided standing at that window that she did not. What she did not expect was for Nathaniel to come home that evening and already know about Mrs. Beaumont's visit. He walked in, set his hat on the hook by the door, with the controlled deliberateness of a man holding something in, and looked at her across the kitchen. I heard Beaumont's wife came, he said. She brought preserves. Amelia. She said what I expected her to say, Amelia said. I showed her out. It's fine. It is not fine. His voice was quiet, but something underneath it was not quiet at all. She had no business coming here. She had every intention of coming here. People like that always do. She turned back to the pot she'd been stirring. It doesn't change anything. It changes the fact that my neighbors are standing outside your door, making you feel unwelcome in your own house. She paused, set the spoon down slowly, turned around. Nathaniel, she said, I grew up in a one-room cottage in a county that looked past me every Sunday at church. I have been unwelcome in rooms my entire life, Mrs. Beaumont is not a new experience for me. She held his gaze. What I need you to do is not go and say something to Robert Beaumont that turns a rude woman's social call into an actual conflict. His jaw was tight. I know what she implied. I was there. She picked up the spoon again. Supper's in 20 minutes. The auditor's report should be ready by Thursday, and when it is, every single thing, Mrs. Beaumont implied, will be answered by the paper in your hand. That's the only response worth giving. A long silence. "You are remarkably difficult to argue with," he said finally. "My father was a minister who argued scripture with drunk men at midnight. I had good training." She pointed at the door with the spoon. "Go wash up." He went. She let out a breath and turned back to the pot. And the small, private truth she hadn't said aloud was this, Mrs. Beaumont's words had not wounded her because they'd been unjust. They'd wounded her because they'd been anticipated. Because Amelia had stood in the county's collective vision her whole life and seen exactly how little space it was willing to make for her. She had married Nathaniel Whitaker to survive. She had not married him to earn the county's approval. She stirred the pot, and she reminded herself of that, and after a while, it almost worked. The auditor's report came on Thursday. It was worse than Amelia had estimated. Not 12 to 18%, closer to 22. Over 3 years, Garrett Pruett had been adjusting figures so carefully, so gradually, that no single year's discrepancy was large enough to demand immediate explanation. It was the kind of patience that required either extreme intelligence or extreme arrogance, and in Amelia's experience, those two things were rarely found apart. Nathaniel read the report twice without speaking. She watched him read it. Watched the way his hand stayed perfectly still on the pages while something behind his eyes moved like weather. "He came to Thomas's funeral," Nathaniel said at last. She hadn't known that. "He stood at the grave and he shook my hand and he said Thomas was a fine man. He set the papers down. He said it to my face." There was nothing useful she could say to that, so she said nothing. "I want him gone by the end of the week," Nathaniel said. "From the farm and from the county, if the sheriff can manage it." "He can," she said. "The sheriff will manage it quickly once he sees those numbers. Pruett stole from a Whitaker. That matters in this county whether it should or not." Nathaniel looked up at her sharply. There was something almost raw in the look. "Does that bother you? That my name makes it matter more?" She considered him honestly. "It used to, before I understood that the name is the only tool on this particular table." She folded her hands in her lap. "I've learned to use the tools that are available, Mr. Whitaker. I don't have to love all of them." He was quiet for a moment. "You called me Nathaniel last Tuesday." She blinked. "Did I? When you told me to go wash up?" A beat. And then, absurdly, she felt the corner of her mouth threaten to move. "I don't recall that." "I do," he said, and something in the way he said it made the air in the room change slightly, not toward anything dangerous or overwhelming, just different. More present. As if two people who had been occupying the same space had suddenly become aware of each other in a way that hadn't happened before. She cleared her throat and picked up the auditor's report. "The sheriff's office opens at 8. I know when the sheriff's office opens." "Then you should go tomorrow morning. Take the report. Don't let them slow walk it. Pruett will be packing by now if he has any sense." "Amelia." "Thank you," he said, quietly. Without performance. The two words landed cleanly, without elaboration, and that was exactly why they landed so hard. She nodded once, set the report back down. "Don't thank me yet," she said, because it was easier than the alternative, and she went to find Mrs. Elmore. Pruett was gone within 4 days. The sheriff's deputy rode out to his property on Friday morning with the report in hand and a warrant behind it, and by Friday afternoon, Garrett Pruett's 7-year tenure at Whitaker Farm had concluded in the particular ignominy of a man being escorted off land he thought he owned. Amelia heard about it from the field workers. That was where she spent most of her mornings now, not in the house, not managing Mrs. Elmore's already efficient domain, but out in the fields, walking the rows, learning the names of the men and women who worked the land that now bore her name by marriage. She had made up her mind on her second day at the farm that she would not be a woman who lived at a distance from the work, and so she had introduced herself to every worker on the property, remembered every name. and asked the kinds of questions that caused people to look at her sideways the first time and then answer honestly the second time. It was a young man named Eli who told her about Pruitt's removal. Eli was 17, slight and careful with his words, the kind of person who watched everything and said only what he was sure of. They say he went quiet, Eli told her, not looking up from the irrigation channel he was clearing. Didn't argue. Just packed his things. Good, Amelia said. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Whitaker? Some of us, the men who've been here longest, he paused, choosing carefully. We noticed things. Over the years. The way numbers didn't match up with what we were producing. But nobody said anything because
he was Mr.
Whitaker's man, she said. Yes, ma'am. She crouched down beside the irrigation channel, examining the blockage, buying them both a moment. Eli, if you ever notice something on this property that doesn't seem right, anything about the land, the animals, the books, anything, I want you to tell me. Directly. You won't be overstepping. He looked at her then, for the first time in the conversation, with the direct, measuring look of a young person deciding whether an adult can be trusted. Even if it's something big, he asked. Especially then, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and went back to the channel. She stood and walked back toward the house, and she thought about all the things people don't say, because they assume it isn't their place, because they have been taught, slowly, persistently, that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. She thought about how much damage that silence could do over 7 years. Over a lifetime. She resolved not to be someone who rewarded it. That evening, Nathaniel found her in the study again. She had moved on from the accounts, those were in the hands of the auditor now, and was working her way through a different kind of documentation entirely, the records of every field, every crop rotation, every equipment purchase and labor agreement going back 15 years. The history of the farm written in dry columns and faded ink, and she was reading it the way she'd once read scripture, looking for the pattern underneath the pattern. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway and looked at her in the particular way he'd developed over the past 2 weeks, not surprised anymore, but not entirely accustomed either. As if he kept expecting her to be different than she was and kept being brought up short by the reality of her. The East Field drainage, she said, without looking up. Your father started a project in 1807 to redirect the southern portion of the creek bed. He stopped it before it was finished. There are notes here about why he ran short of labor that summer, but the partial work he completed is actually still holding. If you build on what he started rather than starting over, you save about 40% of the projected cost. Silence. How did you? Nathaniel said. I read. She looked up. There are 12 years of records in this study that nobody appears to have touched since your father died. They're not organized well, but they're complete. There's a great deal of useful information in them if someone takes the time. He came into the room and looked at the documents spread across the desk. I haven't been in here much, he said, since he passed. She understood what that meant. Not just grief, the specific kind of avoidance that comes from a room that still smells like someone gone. She had cleared out her own father's study with her hands shaking, because every drawer had been a small private memorial. Do you want me to work somewhere else? She asked. If this room, he said it quickly, then more measured, no. It's good that someone's using it. He looked at the papers with the expression of a man doing something effortful, something that cost him. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me about the creek bed. So she told him about the creek bed. She spread the 15-year-old diagrams across the desk between them and walked him through his own land's history, and he listened with his full attention in the way she was starting to recognize as distinctly his completely still, eyes steady. Asking his questions at exactly the right moment. She had come to understand, a man who thought before he spoke, who had no interest in talking simply to fill silence. She appreciated that more than she would have predicted. They worked for 3 hours. The candles burned low. At some point, Mrs. Elmore appeared in the doorway, looked at them both with an expression that had shifted over the past 2 weeks from neutral efficiency to something that might have been cautious approval, and disappeared again without saying a word. When the candles were nearly gone, Nathaniel stood and stretched, and Amelia gathered the papers into the orderly stacks she preferred. "Your father knew this land," she said. A pause. "Better than I do. I spent 8 years away, military, then the war." He stopped. Started again. "I came back to a place I knew the shape of, but not the life of it, if that makes sense. Like reading a map of somewhere you've never actually walked." She looked at him across the desk. "And now?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave most things. "Now someone's making me walk it." She picked up the last stack of papers. "Good," she said. "It's your land. You should know it." She moved toward the door. He didn't move, and she became aware, in the specific, physical way of a person in a small space with another person, that he was watching her go. "Amelia." She paused. "Are you?" He stopped. Seemed to be determining which version of the question he actually intended to ask. "Are you all right here?" Genuinely. Not, "I'm not asking to be told what I want to hear." She turned and looked at him. The candle on his side of the desk was nearly out, and it cast the room in a warmth that made everything look different than it did in daylight, softer at the edges, more uncertain. He looked, in that light, less like the controlled, precise man who had stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, and more like someone who had been holding a great deal together through sheer force of will, and was beginning quietly to wonder how much longer he could maintain the grip. "I am all right," she said, and because he had asked her not to say what he wanted to hear, most of the time. Some of it still strange. He nodded, as if that was the answer he'd expected, and was relieved to have it confirmed as honest. "Most of it is still strange for me too," he said. It was possibly the most personal thing he had said to her. She nodded once, and she left him there with the dying candle, and she carried the weight of those words down the hall with her, like something she needed to be careful not to drop. 3 weeks into the marriage, the county's opinion crystallized into 2 distinct camps. The first camp, composed primarily of the older, established families with long memories of the Whitaker name, decided that Nathaniel had made a miscalculation. This view was represented most vocally by a man named Cyrus Aldgate, who had daughters of marriageable age and had apparently been operating on the reasonable expectation that one of them would eventually become Mrs. Whitaker. Cyrus had not said anything directly to Nathaniel yet. He was building to it. Amelia could tell from the way he watched her at the county assembly they attended in their 4th week, a polite social gathering, where Amelia's presence was technically correct, but her welcome was distinctly conditional, that Cyrus Aldgate was a man who planned his moves carefully and did not act until he was certain. She kept an eye on him. The second camp, composed mostly of people who worked for a living and had no particular stake in Nathaniel's matrimonial decisions, seemed to be arriving, gradually, at something closer to curiosity. News of Pruitt's removal had spread, and along with it, the associated fact that the new Mrs. Whitaker had been instrumental in uncovering what he'd done. This information traveled through the working community of Hargrove County with a different character than it traveled through the drawing rooms there. It had been a scandal. Here, it was something closer to a story about a woman who had done something useful, and those stories tended to be well received by people who valued usefulness. Nathaniel stood beside her at the assembly with the controlled, erect posture of a military man in unfamiliar territory, which was not inaccurate. Social gatherings had never been his natural environment. And she could see from the slight set of his jaw that he was managing the room the way he might manage a hostile position. Systematically, without pleasure. "You hate this," she said quietly in a gap between conversations. "I don't hate it," he said. "You've shaken 9 hands in 40 minutes and not smiled once." I smiled. You bared your teeth. There's a distinction. The corner of his mouth moved, almost involuntarily. You're observant. Constantly. It's why Mrs. Beaumont avoids making eye contact with me tonight. He glanced across the room. Mrs. Beaumont was, in fact, directing her attention to the far wall, whenever Amelia's gaze moved in her direction. I spoke with Robert Beaumont, Nathaniel said, carefully. Amelia turned her head slowly and looked at him. I told you not to. I told him his wife was not to come to our home again unless invited. He met her eyes. That's not the same as making a conflict. It is precisely the same. Amelia. His voice was low, and it had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not the clipped authority of a man giving orders, but something more direct. More personal. I am aware of what you told me, and I understand why you said it. But I will not stand in a room and watch people treat you with contempt because it's politically convenient to stay quiet. A beat. That is not negotiable. She looked at him. He looked back. Something moved between them, not romance, not yet. Not anything so clear or comfortable as that, but something that shifted the ground slightly. The way it shifts when you've been walking level and suddenly realize the terrain has been changing under your feet for some time without your noticing. Thank you, she said at last, quietly. He nodded and looked back across the room, and she looked back across the room, and they stood side by side in their careful, constructed arrangement, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the silence between them had a different quality now than it had had before. It was Cyrus Aldgate who moved first. He crossed the room toward them with the confidence of a man who had owned his corner of the world, for long enough to forget that he hadn't always. And he shook Nathaniel's hand with the practiced warmth of someone who has learned that warmth is currency. And he said, Nathaniel. Good to see you looking well. His eyes moved to Amelia with the efficiency of an appraisal. And the new Mrs. Whitaker. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Amelia, she said, and did not add anything else, because her last name was his name now, and she would be damned before she handed it to him like an offering. Cyrus Aldgate, he said. My family and the Whitakers go back many years. He said it to her, but he was looking at Nathaniel. Many years. I consider Nathaniel almost a son. How kind, Amelia said. We've been concerned, naturally, after the business with Pruitt. He shook his head with great sorrow. Terrible thing, when a man abuses a trust. I always said Pruitt had hungry eyes, didn't I, Nathaniel? Nathaniel said nothing. The important thing, Aldgate continued, is that no real damage was done. These things happen when a man has too much on his mind to watch the details himself. His gaze moved back to Amelia with a smile that had more edges than warmth. Though I understand Mrs. Whitaker took quite an active interest in the accounts. She did, Nathaniel said. She found what 3 years of professional management missed. A small silence. Aldgate's smile held its shape, but something behind it shifted. Well, he said, a woman with a talent for numbers. That's something. It is, Nathaniel agreed pleasantly. Among other things, Aldgate looked at Amelia with the look of a man recalibrating. She returned it with the expression of a woman who has been underestimated so many times it has ceased to surprise her and has begun, instead, to be useful. I imagine you're finding Whitaker Farm quite an adjustment, Aldgate said to her. After he paused. Different circumstances. Everything worth doing is an adjustment at first, she said. I find adjustments clarifying. They show you very quickly who understands what's happening and who's still working from old assumptions. Aldgate laughed. It was a real laugh, slightly startled, and she understood in that moment that it was the most honest thing he'd done since crossing the room. Well, he said again, you're not what I expected, Mrs. Whitaker. No, she said, I rarely am. He excused himself shortly afterman with the slightly different posture of a man who has encountered resistance where he expected none and is privately rearranging his plans. Nathaniel watched him go. That was well handled. I grew up invisible in this county, Amelia said quietly. You learn a great deal about how people operate when they don't think you're watching. What did you learn about Aldgate? She was quiet for a moment. That he's not finished. He wasn't here tonight to welcome me. He was here to evaluate me. She glanced sideways at Nathaniel. And I think I made him more cautious, not less interested. We should expect to hear from him again. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. What does he want? That I haven't determined yet. She set her empty glass on a passing tray. But whatever it is, it involves you and not me. I'm just the obstacle he hadn't accounted for. He looked at her with that steady, unreadable look. Then you don't seem concerned. I am concerned, she said. I'm just not panicking. They're different things. She straightened. Come on. Mrs. Harmon is moving toward you with the determined expression of a woman who wants to tell you about her nephew's land dispute, and if you don't intercept her at the punch bowl, she'll corner you by the fireplace for 40 minutes. Nathaniel turned. How do you know about the nephew's land dispute? Because she mentioned it to Mrs. Elmore 3 days ago, and Mrs. Elmore mentioned it to me. She moved toward the punch bowl. Mrs. Elmore mentions things to me now. There it was again, that almost movement at the corner of his mouth, that crack in the composed surface. Does she? She does. You should take it as a good sign. Mrs. Elmore does not mention things to people she doesn't trust. He fell into step beside her. They navigated the room together, with the efficiency of people who had, without formally discussing it, developed a working system. She read the social terrain, and he provided the authority her name now carried. And between the two of them, they managed the room better than either could have managed alone. It wasn't love. She knew that. She was careful with that knowledge, turned it over when it surfaced, examined it for the kind of wishful thinking she couldn't afford. But it was something. A partnership in the original sense of the word, two people who had agreed to carry the same weight in the same direction. And that evening, riding home through the August dark, with the stars coming out over Virginia and the horses moving in comfortable rhythm, Nathaniel said, "Thank you for tonight," and she said, "You're welcome," and neither of them said anything more, but the silence on the way home was entirely different from the silence on the way there. That was the week she found Thomas's letter. It was tucked inside the back cover of the old farm ledger she'd been working through, folded into quarters, the paper soft from handling as though it had been opened and refolded many times. She almost missed it entirely. It had been worked so far into the binding that it was nearly invisible. She might have closed the ledger and moved on if the edge of it hadn't caught the candlelight at exactly the right angle. She opened it slowly. It was dated 6 weeks before Thomas Carter died. Nathaniel, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back, which means you're doing exactly what I told you not to do, which is falling apart somewhere quietly, where nobody can see you. I know you, stop it. She sat very still. I need you to look after Amelia. Not because she can't look after herself, she can. Better than either of us. Probably, but because the world is not kind to women alone, and I won't be there to remind it to be. She's the best person I know. She's also stubborn as a mule, and she won't ask for help, so you'll have to not give her the option. You know how to do that. You've been doing it to me for years. I don't know what happens next. I don't know what shape looking after her takes. But I know you, Nathaniel, and I know you'll figure out the right thing if you stop standing in your own way long enough to see it. Don't let the guilt eat you. I made my own choices. So did you. That's all there is to it. Come home. Live the rest of it. For both of us. Tom, she sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Outside the window, the Virginia night was full of crickets and summer heat, and the distant sound of the horses settling in the barn. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Footsteps down the hall. Nathaniel, coming in from wherever he'd been in the evening dark. She thought about putting the letter back where she'd found it. She thought about it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, slid it into her apron pocket, and picked up the ledger again with hands that were not entirely steady. Because the letter was not hers, it had been written to him, and what she did with it was a question she needed to think through with more care than she had right now. in a candlelit room with the sound of his footsteps still in her ears. But one thing she knew, with absolute, unshakable certainty. Thomas Carter had understood exactly what he was doing when he asked Nathaniel Whitaker to look after his sister. And whatever happened next, she was no longer sure the story was entirely what either of them had believed it to be. She carried Thomas's letter for 5 days before she said anything. 5 days of folding it back into her apron pocket every morning, of feeling its weight through the fabric when she bent over the ledgers, of lying awake at night, turning over the question of whether giving it to Nathaniel would help him or break something in him that was only just beginning cautiously to hold its shape. She watched him during those 5 days with the careful attention she'd developed over the past weeks, the kind of watching that looked like ordinary presence but was actually a continuous, low-level reading of a person's temperature. She had learned his rhythms by now, learned that he was at his most honest in the evenings when the day's work was done and the house settled around them. Learned that he never spoke Thomas's name voluntarily, but that something shifted in him when it was spoken by others, a tightening so small and controlled that you'd miss it if you weren't looking. Learned that he had nightmares, because twice now she had heard him moving through the house in the hours before dawn, and both times she had lain still and listened to him pace and then stop, and then the silence that followed had a particular, exhausted quality that she recognized from her own worst nights. She had not gotten up. She had not knocked on his door. She had not been sure it was her place. After 5 days, she decided the letter was her place, and that waiting any longer was a kind of cowardice she didn't have patience for in herself. She found him in the barn on a Saturday morning, working alongside Eli and 2 of the older farm hands on the harness rigging that had needed repair for weeks. He was coatless again, sleeves up, doing the actual physical work rather than supervising it, which she had stopped being surprised by. It was one of the things about him that consistently refused to match the image she'd been given of rich men. She waited until Eli and the others had moved to the far end of the barn. Nathaniel. He looked up from the leather he was stitching. "I need to show you something," she said, "when you have a moment." He read her face. She could see him do it, that rapid, precise assessment he'd carried home from the war, and he set the rigging down and straightened. "Now is fine." She led him to the study. She closed the door behind them, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. She saw his eyes go to the closed door for just a second before returning to her. She took the letter from her apron pocket and placed it on the desk between them. He looked at it, at the handwriting on the front. His name, in Thomas's hand. She'd seen enough of Thomas's letters to their father to recognize it. The tall, slightly crowded capitals, the way he pressed hard on the pen. Nathaniel did not move for a long moment. "Where did you find this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Inside the back cover of the 1812 ledger. "I think he must have left it there the last time he was home. Before he shipped out." She paused. I don't know if he intended for you to find it here, or if he meant to give it to you himself and never had the chance." Another moment of stillness. Then Nathaniel reached out and picked up the letter. He turned it over once, looked at his name. She could see, even with all of his control, even with every careful layer of composure he'd built and maintained, she could see what it cost him just to hold it. "Have you read it?" Yes. She didn't apologize for it. "I didn't know what it was until I'd already opened it. By the time I understood, I'd read enough. Stopping felt dishonest." He nodded once, as if that was a reasonable accounting, and she appreciated that he didn't punish her for the truth. He unfolded the letter. She watched him read it. She had prepared herself for different versions of this, for him to go very still, for his face to close down completely, for him to fold the letter and thank her with a voice that meant she should leave the room. She had prepared herself for controlled grief, the kind he appeared to be an expert at. She had not prepared herself for the sound he made. It was quiet. Almost nothing, a single sharp intake of breath, controlled almost immediately, bitten back before it could become anything larger. But she heard it, and it was the sound of a man who had been holding something for so long that encountering it directly, without warning, without armor, had knocked the air straight out of him. His hand was flat on the desk now, the letter pressed under it. His head was down, she said. He didn't answer. Nathaniel. She moved around the desk. I'm fine, he said, in the specific, terrible voice of a person who is not fine and knows it and cannot stop saying it anyway. You don't have to be, she said. He lifted his head then, and she saw what he'd been hiding under all of it, not just grief, but something darker and more specific. Something that had been eating at him from the inside since the day Thomas Carter died in his arms, on a Virginia battlefield. I gave the order, he said, that day. The position we were holding, I assessed the risk. I made the call, I ordered the men to hold. His jaw was rigid. If I had ordered the retreat 20 minutes earlier, Thomas would have been clear. He would have made it. His eyes met hers. I know because I've calculated it. 100 times, 150 times, 20 minutes. That's the margin. I've been living in those 20 minutes for a year. The room was very quiet. She looked at him, and she thought about Thomas's voice, which she could barely remember now, and she thought about what he had written, "Don't let the guilt eat you. I made my own choices," and she thought about what it meant to carry this. To carry it every day, to fold it into the same controlled, precise exterior, and just keep walking. You were an officer, she said, in an active engagement. You made a tactical decision under conditions that gave you incomplete information and demanded an immediate answer. And your decision, she paused, was wrong. In the way that decisions made in incomplete information sometimes are. I'm not finished. She kept her voice steady. Your decision was wrong. And Thomas died. And both of those things are true simultaneously, without one canceling the other, and without either of them making you a murderer. She held his gaze. You are not a murderer, Nathaniel. You are a man who made an imperfect decision in an impossible situation and has been prosecuting himself for it ever since. I gave the order, he said again, as if repetition could produce a different verdict. Thomas chose to be there, she said. He signed his papers. He took his position. He made his choices, the same as you made yours. She was aware of her voice dropping lower, more direct. Do you know what he said to me the last time I saw him? A week before he shipped out. He said, Amelia, I'm not going, because I have to. I'm going because I believe in it. She stopped. He did not go to war as your subordinate waiting to be sacrificed. He went as a man who chose his purpose, a beat. If you take his death from him and make it your fault alone, you take that away from him. You take away his choice. And that, her voice tightened, is the one thing Thomas Carter would never forgive. The silence after that was enormous. Nathaniel stared at her. She could see him turning it over the way he took things and subjected them to a thorough and merciless internal examination before he accepted or rejected them. She could see the resistance in him, the long habit of self-prosecution, pushing back against an argument it hadn't encountered in this precise form before. And then slowly, like something geological, like the shift of land that has been under unter elbow pressure for too long, something in him moved. He sat down, not with intention, not controlled. His legs simply performed the function and he was in the chair, with his elbows on the desk and the letter still under one hand, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do. He always talked about you like that, Nathaniel said. His voice was different now, lower, rougher at the edges, as if the composure had worn through in patches. Like, you were the one holding the center of things. We'd be in some godforsaken field camp, half the unit down with fever, 3 days from any supply line, and Thomas would say, you know what Amelia would do? She'd have built a drainage system and started a school by now. A sound came out of her that she hadn't intended, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. Something that stung at the back of her eyes. He exaggerated, she said. He didn't. Nathaniel looked at her directly. I've been here 6 weeks and you found an embezzler, saved my drainage project, managed the county assembly better than I have in 3 years. and befriended every worker on this property. He shook his head. He wasn't exaggerating. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she always did when something moved her too much. For a direct response, she picked up the practical thread. "He loved you," she said. "You should know that. Not as a commanding officer. He loved you as a friend. He talked about you in every letter he ever sent home." Nathaniel did this. Nathaniel said that, "Nathaniel is the most infuriating person I have ever met, and I would follow him into hell without thinking twice." She swallowed. "I knew who you were before you ever came to my door. I just didn't know what to make of you in person." He was watching her. She held his gaze. "Now I'm still working it out." For the first time since she'd placed the letter on the desk, something happened in his face that wasn't grief or guilt or the effortful weight of a man holding himself together. It was brief, barely there, but it was warmer than anything she'd seen in him, and it changed the quality of the air between them in a way that she felt in her sternum and did not entirely know what to do with. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the letter." And stopped. "The rest of it. I meant what I said," she told him. "I know you did," he said. "That's why it helped." She picked up her apron and moved toward the door. She needed to go do something useful, check on the drainage project, find Eli, something with a clear purpose and a measurable outcome. Because the conversation they had just had was sitting in her chest like an ember, and she needed to give it room rather than accidentally fan it into something before she understood its shape. "Amelia." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was still at the desk, the letter visible under his hand, and he looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that had been unreadable the first time she'd seen them and were becoming, gradually, more legible to her in ways that were both clarifying and unsettling. "Thomas was right," he said quietly, "about you holding the center of things." She didn't answer that. She couldn't. She nodded once and left him there, and she carried the ember carefully all the way down the hall and out into the August morning and let the summer heat be the thing that steadied her. Because the sun didn't know or care about anything that happened inside the house, and sometimes indifference was exactly the right medicine. It was 2 days later when Cyrus Aldgate made his move. He came to the farm in person, which Amelia had predicted, though the timing was slightly earlier than she'd expected. He arrived mid-morning with the casual ease of a man making a friendly call, accompanied by another man she didn't immediately recognize, well-dressed, slightly younger, with the specific kind of confident affability that in her experience meant either a lawyer or a man who wished he were one. Nathaniel received them in the front parlor. Amelia was not invited. She was, however, in the adjacent room with the door 3 inches open, because she had learned very early in life that the most useful position for a woman was frequently the nobody remembered to account for. "I appreciate you seeing me," Aldgate began, with the warmth of a man who knows he holds a card. "I know it's been a complicated few weeks." "Sit down, Cyrus," Nathaniel said. He wasn't doing the cordial voice, the one he used for social situations he found tedious but necessary. This was his flat, direct voice, and Aldgate's practiced smile adjusted slightly. "I'll come straight to the point," Aldgate said, which meant he was about to do no such thing. "This is my associate, Franklin Cole. He's a land attorney, practices down in Richmond, very well regarded." A pause. "I've asked him here because I have a concern I think you should hear from someone qualified to explain its implications." "Then let Mr. Cole explain them," Nathaniel said. Cole opened a document case and extracted a set of papers with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this. "Mr. Whitaker, we've been examining the boundary surveys for your east acreage, specifically the 340 acres that include the southern creek bed and the adjacent timberland." Amelia went still. "There is a question," Cole continued, "regarding the original survey lines from 1798. The instrument used a poorly calibrated Gunter's chain, produced a margin of error that we believe, upon resurvey, may place approximately 60 acres of your southern timberland outside your legal boundary." "Silence. Outside my boundary," Nathaniel said slowly. And inside whose? Cole glanced at Aldgate. Aldgate spread his hands with the expression of a man performing reluctance. The adjacent land at the time of the original survey belonged to my father. It passed to me 12 years ago. He paused. I want to be clear, Nathaniel, I don't want to dispute. This is exactly the opposite of what I want, which is why I've come to you privately, before this goes anywhere formal. I think we can resolve this between gentlemen. There it was. Amelia understood it completely now, the county assembly, the measured evaluation, the patience. Aldgate had been working toward this for weeks. He'd needed to understand what he was dealing with before he revealed what he held. And what he held was a boundary claim that, if it went to court, would consume years and money and energy, and which he had apparently calculated Nathaniel would prefer to settle quietly. She heard Nathaniel say, "What kind of resolution are you proposing?" "Something straightforward. The timberland in question is valuable, I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm not a man who takes what doesn't belong to him. I'd propose a fair purchase price, below market but not insultingly so. You'd receive compensation for what the survey error has technically cost you, and we'd resolve this without it becoming a county matter." A pause. "The alternative is a formal resurvey, which becomes public record, which raises questions about every adjacent property's boundary, which is a mess that benefits no one." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough for Amelia to calculate exactly 3 things simultaneously. 1. Aldgate had clearly done this before. 2. The offer was designed to look generous while actually recovering 60 acres of prime timberland at well below their value. 3. Nathaniel did not know what she had found in the 1,807 records. She made her decision in the space of a single breath. She opened the door and walked into the parlor. The effect was immediate and satisfying. Cole looked up from his papers with surprise. Aldgate's expression did a rapid, complex movement that he controlled before it fully formed. Nathaniel turned, and his eyes found hers instantly. She placed a document on the table between them. "Before this conversation goes any further," she said, "I think Mr. Cole should look at this." Nathaniel looked at the document. "Amelia, 807 remedial survey," she said. She kept her voice entirely pleasant and her hands entirely steady. "Commissioned by your father after a boundary dispute with the Harrison family to the north. He hired a surveyor from Fredericksburg, an independent, not a county instrument, and produced new survey lines for the entire southern acreage." She looked at Cole. "Those lines are legally registered at the county seat. They supersede the 1,798th survey, and they place the timberland in question firmly within Whitaker property." The silence that followed had a very particular quality. Cole picked up the document. He looked at it. He turned it over. His eyes moved across the registration marks at the bottom, and something in his professional composure shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly, in the way that a man shifts when the ground he thought was solid shows a crack. "Where did you find this?" Aldgate asked. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth was gone. "In your father's study," she said to Nathaniel, and then to Aldgate. "He kept meticulous records. I've been working through them." She tilted her head slightly. "It took about an hour to find. I imagine the county records office would have found it in about the same time, had anyone thought to ask." Aldgate looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Aldgate with an expression that was, Amelia thought, one of the more quietly dangerous things she'd seen on a person's face. "I think," Nathaniel said, "that Mr. Cole might want a moment to review that document." Cole was already reviewing it with the focused attention of a professional who has discovered that his case foundation that has just significantly shifted. Aldgate leaned back. Some of the performance went out of him, not all of it, but enough. He was recalculating. She could see it. "This doesn't necessarily resolve the question," Aldgate said, but certainty was gone from it. "It resolves it entirely," Amelia said. "A registered independent survey from 1,807 conducted under legal requirements of the period, filed at the county seat, supersedes an instrument survey from 1798 under Virginia property law. Mr. Cole knows that. They all looked at Cole, who said, carefully, the document would need to be verified. It will verify, she said, because it's genuine. I can show you the matching entry in the county register if you'd like to ride to the courthouse this afternoon. She looked at Aldgate. I'd welcome the trip. Nathaniel stood. I think we're done here, he said. His voice was very quiet. Cyrus, I've known you a long time. I'll chalk this up to a genuine misunderstanding about the survey history, because the alternative interpretation is one that would end our acquaintance permanently, and I don't want that. Aldgate looked at him. Something moved in the older man's face that might, on a different kind of person, have been shame. That's generous, Aldgate said. My wife found the document in an hour, Nathaniel said. Imagine what the county would find in a formal inquiry. A pause. I don't want a formal inquiry, Cyrus. I want my 60 acres and my neighbor's good faith. Can we agree on that? A long moment. We can agree on that, Aldgate said. Cole repacked his document case. Both men left with the somewhat diminished air of people who had arrived expecting a negotiation and discovered they'd been sitting at the wrong table. The door closed. Amelia stood in the parlor with her heart, beating significantly faster than she intended to let it show, and she released a breath in a long, controlled exhale. Nathaniel turned to her. She braced for something gratitude, perhaps, or the slightly uncomfortable mix of gratitude and pride that men sometimes produced when a woman had just done something they wished they'd done themselves. What she got instead was, when did you find the 1807 survey? 4 days ago, she said, when I was going through the boundary documentation for the drainage project. 4 days. I didn't know it was relevant until Aldgate arrived this morning. The moment Cole said boundary survey, I knew what they were doing. She picked up the document from the table. I should have been more systematic about organizing your father's papers. I'll finish cataloging them this week. Nathaniel crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. Close, not inappropriately close, but closer than the carefully maintained distance of the past 6 weeks, and she felt the shift in it the way you feel a change in temperature. Amelia, he said. She made herself meet his eyes. That man had been planning that for weeks, Nathaniel said. He had a lawyer. He had documents. He had an entire approach designed to make me feel like cooperating was in my own interest. His jaw was tight. And you ended it in 4 minutes with a piece of paper you found in my dead father's study. 3 minutes, she said, because focusing on precision was steadier than focusing on how close he was standing. Stop, he said quietly. I'm trying to say something. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, and she could see everything moving in them, the gratitude. Yes, but also something that was not gratitude. Something older and more complicated and directed at her, with an intensity that she felt in her hands. I didn't want a wife, he said. I want you to know that. When I came to your door, I wasn't looking for a partner. I was looking to discharge a debt and go back to being the man I'd been before. He paused. I don't know what I'm doing now, but it isn't that. Her heart was doing something inconvenient. What is it? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she deserved credit for. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but it isn't nothing. She held his gaze for exactly 1 more second than was safe, and then she looked down at the document in her hands and said, I'm going to catalog the remaining papers this week, and she moved toward the door before the moment could have become anything that neither of them was ready for. Amelia. She stopped. Didn't turn. If you ever want to know what Thomas said about you at the end, he said quietly. I'll tell you, when you're ready. She stood very still. Not today, she said. No, he agreed, not today. She walked out into the August morning, and she did not look back, and she cataloged documents with a precision that would have impressed a county clerk And she did not think about Nathaniel Whitaker, standing in the parlor, with his honest eyes and his almost confession. And she did not think about it. And she did not think about it. And she did not entirely succeed. It was the last week of August when the first autumn coolness moved through Virginia. Just barely. Just at the edges of the morning, a reminder that the heat never lasted. That seasons changed whether you were ready or not. She was in the kitchen before dawn, the way she always was, when she heard the sound of Nathaniel's door. Not unusual he rose early. But this time, instead of hearing him continue past to the back of the house, the footsteps stopped outside the kitchen. A pause. Then his voice through the door, "Amelia, you're up." "I'm always up," she said. He came in. He looked like a man who had not slept well, and she recognized the particular quality of it now, the war following him into the dark. She said nothing about it. She pushed a cup of coffee toward him and went back to the bread she was working. He sat down at the table. He wrapped both hands around the cup. After a long silence, he said, "Tell me something about him." "That I don't know." She kept working the bread. "He hated thunder," she said after a moment. "Since he was a boy." He'd never admit it, obviously. He'd become very busy with something that required his attention in another room, and if there was no other room, he'd start telling a very long story until the thunder passed. She paused. He thought nobody knew. Everyone knew. Nathaniel was quiet. Then, roughly, he used to talk in his sleep. On campaign. Full conversations. Once he negotiated at length with someone about the price of a horse and woke himself up arguing about the bridle. She stopped working. She was looking down at the bread dough, not at him. He would have hated the drama of it, she said. The war, and how people talk about it now. Sacrifice and glory. He used to say war was mostly waiting and boredom with terrible interruptions. Yes, his voice was thick. He said that. She turned then, and she looked at him, this man, who had carried her brother home in memory and guilt for a year, who had shown up on her porch with nothing to offer but honesty and a debt he meant to honor, who had turned out to be so far from what she'd steeled herself against that she was still catching her breath from the surprise of him. He would have liked this, she said quietly, whatever this is. He would have thought it was exactly right. Nathaniel looked at her across the kitchen table with the specific vulnerability of a person who has put down something very heavy and cannot quite believe the ground is holding without it. "I think he planned it," he said. "Oh, I know he planned it," she said, and something warm moved through her, wry and grieving and certain. Thomas never did anything by accident in his life. Nathaniel looked at her for another moment, and then he laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, really laugh, not the controlled, almost movement at the corner of his mouth, but an actual sound, sudden and unguarded, rough from disuse. It lasted only a moment, but it changed the room completely. She felt it land in her chest, like the first cool morning of a season you forgot you'd been waiting for. She turned back to her bread and said nothing, because some things needed to be let alone in order to survive, and this one she intended to let alone very carefully. Outside, the first thin edge of autumn light was coming up over the Virginia hills, and inside the kitchen, two people sat with the space between them shortened by degrees too small to measure but too real to ignore, and the summer was almost over. And something else quiet, unplanned, entirely resistant to being catalogued, had been growing steadily under all the practical things, the way the creek runs under the ground in dry seasons. Invisible, persistent, and very much present. Autumn came to Whitaker Farm the way it always did in Virginia, not all at once, but in negotiations. A cool morning here, a turned leaf there, the light shifting its angle by degrees so gradual you'd swear nothing was changing until one day you looked up and everything had. Amelia noticed the change in Nathaniel the same way. Not a single moment of transformation, not a dramatic declaration or a sudden reversal of everything that had been before. Just small things, accumulating the way the season accumulated, the way he started leaving the study door open in the evenings, instead of working behind it closed. The way he'd begun stopping by, wherever she was working, to ask what she needed, rather than waiting to be told. The way he'd taken to walking the fields with Eli in the mornings, learning the land the way she'd suggested, asking the questions he should have been asking for a year. And the laugh. She thought about the laugh more than she intended to. It had not happened again, not exactly like that, not with that particular quality of something breaking loose from a long confinement. But something adjacent to it appeared with increasing frequency. A dry comment at supper, a raised eyebrow that said more than a sentence. The very specific almost smile he deployed when she said something he hadn't expected, which was, she was discovering, fairly often. She catalogued all of it in the private ledger she kept in the back of her mind and tried not to examine the entries too closely. The Eastfield Drainage Project broke ground in the first week of September. Nathaniel had taken her recommendation about building on his father's 1,807 work, and the savings were almost exactly what she'd calculated, 41% under the original estimate, which caused the county engineer, who'd priced the first version, to look at her with an expression somewhere between impressed and affronted. She had been on site every morning since it started. This had produced comment, not from Nathaniel, who had long since stopped being surprised by where she turned up, but from the workers themselves, initially uncertain about a woman walking the drainage lines with a copy of the 1,807 survey in her hand and opinions about creekbed redirection, and then, gradually, less uncertain, and then not uncertain at all. Eli had been her quiet advocate in this, she suspected, though he'd never said so directly. She was checking a measurement at the southern end of the project on a Thursday morning when she heard the hoofbeats. 2 riders, moving at speed from the direction of the county road. That particular rhythm urgent, not casual, that made something in Amelia's chest pay attention before her mind had caught up with why. She recognized one of them when they cleared the tree line. Sheriff Aldous Webb, a large, careful man who had always treated her with the particular neutral courtesy of someone reserving final judgment. The other rider she didn't know. She did not run. She walked back to the barn at a pace that was faster than her usual but controlled enough to be dignified, and she found Nathaniel there with his hand already on his hat, because he had seen the riders too. "You know what this is?" she asked. "Not yet," he said. His voice had gone flat and focused in the way it did when something required his full attention. "Stay here." "I will not," she said pleasantly, and fell into step beside him. He gave her one sideways look that acknowledged both her presence and his lack of power over it, and they walked out to meet the sheriff together. Webb reined in. He nodded to Nathaniel, then to Amelia with the same neutral courtesy. "Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Whitaker, apologize for arriving without notice." "What's happened?" Nathaniel said. "This is Mr. James Pruitt," Webb said, indicating the second rider, a man who shared enough of Garrett Pruitt's close-set eyes to be unmistakable. "Garrett Pruitt's brother. He's come from Richmond with a legal claim." Webb's voice was carefully without editorial. Involving the farm, Amelia felt Nathaniel go still beside her. Not the controlled stillness of composure. Something different, the stillness of a person absorbing some blow they'd half expected and hoped wouldn't come. James Pruitt was already talking. He had his brother's easy manner without the intelligence underneath it, the same practiced warmth operating from a shallower well. "Mr. Whitaker, I want to begin by saying there's no hostility here on my part. My brother made mistakes. I don't dispute the auditor's findings." "Then what is the claim?" Nathaniel asked. Pruitt reached into his coat. He produced an envelope with the particular self-consciousness of a man who has been waiting to produce it. "My brother had an agreement with your father, an informal arrangement, drawn up in 1,808, granting him a commission of 15% of the farm's annual profit in exchange for certain services rendered during a period when your father's health was failing." He extended the envelope. The document wasn't filed publicly, but it exists and it's witnessed. Nathaniel did not take the envelope. Amelia did. She opened it with the brisk efficiency of a woman opening the county mail, and she read the document inside with the focused speed of someone who had been reading legal and financial language for years, without the luxury of a second reading. It took her about 90 seconds. "When did your father's health begin to fail?" she asked Nathaniel without looking up. 1808, he said. There was something careful in his voice. Spring of 1808. He recovered by autumn, and Pruett was hired. July 1808, Nathaniel said, "Yes." "So, this agreement." She held up the paper, "claims your father authorized a 15% commission during a period of health crisis, witnessed by two men whose names I'll want to verify." She looked at James Pruett. "Do you have the original, or is this a copy?" Pruett blinked. He'd clearly expected a different reception. "Original." "Where are the witnesses now?" He hesitated. "One passed away in 1811. The other is your brother's father-in-law," Amelia said. "Which would be relevant to a court, considering the document's independence." Another blink. How did you—" "The second witness's surname is the same as Garrett Pruett's wife's maiden name, which I encountered in the farm's employment records from 1808. She folded the document and held it out to Webb rather than returning it to Pruett. "Sheriff, this document would need to be verified by the county court before any claim could be pursued, correct?" Webb took it carefully. "That's correct, Mrs. Whitaker. And during that verification period, the claim has no standing to interrupt the farm's current legal operation." Webb was looking at her with an expression that had moved considerably past neutral. "Also correct." She turned to Nathaniel. "You should have your own attorney review this today." "Not tomorrow, today." The verification process at the county court usually takes 3 to 4 weeks, but Pruett's attorney will try to use the interim period to create pressure for a private settlement. She glanced at Pruett without warmth. "Which is the actual purpose of this visit." James Pruett said, "Now that's not—" "That is exactly what this is," she said, not unkindly, but with the specific directness of a woman who has run out of patience for performances. "Your brother embezzled from this farm for 3 years and is facing formal charges. This document, if it's genuine, may reduce his legal exposure by establishing a prior agreement that partially justifies the commissions he took. But it needs to go through the court, and it will, and in the meantime I would ask you to not return to this property without legal counsel and advance notice." She paused. "That is not hostility. That process." Webb made a sound that was not quite a caw. Nathaniel said nothing. She could feel him standing beside her with the focused, contained energy of a man watching something happen that he has enough self-awareness to stay out of. James Pruett left with considerably less of the easy manner he'd arrived with. Webb lingered for a moment after. He looked at Amelia with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize, something that was arriving at a conclusion the rest of the county was still approaching. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "I'll send word when the court schedules the verification." "Thank you, Sheriff." He rode out. She watched him go. Nathaniel stood beside her in the quiet that followed, and after a moment he said, "He'll come back." "The brother?" "The claim. Even if the document doesn't hold up, he'll find another angle. Garrett Pruett has lost everything, and he is angry, and he has nothing left to do with the anger except direct it here." His voice was level, but she heard the weight underneath it. "I should have managed this better from the beginning." "You're managing it now," she said. "You're managing it," he corrected. She turned and looked at him directly. "We're managing it." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something in him settled, not relaxed, not relieved, but something more durable than either. Something like resolution. "We are," he said, and the way he said it was different from every previous version of that word. Not an acknowledgement, a statement of fact, a choice. She turned back toward the drainage project. "I need to finish the southern measurement before noon." "Amelia." She paused. "When this is fully resolved," he said, "I want to talk to you about something." Not the farm. Not the accounts, a beat. Something else. She stood with her back to him for exactly 3 seconds. "All right," she said, and walked back to the drainage lines, and did not let herself wonder what it was for the rest of the morning, and failed completely. The attorney's name was Carver, a lean, precise man from Fredericksburg, whom Nathaniel trusted, and who arrived the following day to review the Pruitt document with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Amelia sat in on the meeting, as she sat in on everything now, without comment from Nathaniel, and without friction. Carver's conclusion, delivered with the measured economy of a man who charged by the hour and respected both his clients and the clock, was this: the document was probably genuine in origin, probably witnessed legitimately, and almost certainly inadmissible as grounds for any commission payment, because the services it cited were never formally delivered in the form described, and because the witnessed signatures had a relationship to the Pruitt family that the court would view unfavorably. "Probably inadmissible," Nathaniel repeated. 80 to 90%, Carver said. "The remaining 10 is the corner you'll want to manage. I'd recommend a proactive filing with the county court establishing the farm's position before Pruitt's attorney gets there." He paused. "I'd also recommend doing it soon. Courts respond to who moves first, sometimes more than they should." "How soon?" Amelia asked. "This week would be ideal." "Tomorrow would be better." She looked at Nathaniel. He nodded once. Carver left to begin the filing. The house was quiet. Nathaniel was at the window, and she was at the desk where she'd done so much of her working through of this farm's accumulated problems. And they were both quiet in the particular way of two people who have just made a significant decision together and are separately absorbing its weight. "He's not going to stop," Nathaniel said. He wasn't talking about the brother. "No," she said. "Garrett Pruitt is going to be a problem until the formal charges conclude. After that," she considered, "after that it will depend on what the court decides." "What do you think the court will decide?" She was honest. "I think they'll convict him. The auditor's documentation is thorough and the discrepancies are clear. But I think his attorney will argue mitigating factors." She stopped. Something had occurred to her, something she had not thought through to its conclusion before. She sat back slowly. "What?" Nathaniel asked. He had turned from the window. He read her the way she'd learned to read him, not perfectly, but with increasing accuracy. "The document," she said carefully. "The commission agreement. If it's genuine, and Carver thinks it is, then your father signed it. Which means your father knew on some level that Pruitt expected compensation above his salary." She paused. "That doesn't excuse what Pruitt did. The amounts he took were far beyond any reasonable commission, and the arrangement was never formalized or disclosed. But it means the story has a layer I hadn't accounted for." Nathaniel came and sat across from her at the desk. He put both hands flat on the surface. "My father was ill in 1808, he said slowly. He made decisions during that period that he expressed regret about. He never told me specifics." His eyes met hers. "You think Pruitt was exploiting an agreement my father made when his judgment was compromised?" "I think that's possible, which makes Pruitt's culpability complex rather than simple, and complex culpability is harder to prosecute cleanly." She held his gaze. "It doesn't change that he stole from you, but it changes how the court may see his motivation, and it may change the outcome." Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. She could see him working through it, not just the legal calculus, but something more personal. Something about his father, and what it meant to discover that the man had left behind complications along with the land. "He wasn't a perfect man," Nathaniel said finally. "My father. He was a good man who made poor decisions under pressure and then tried to build back from them." He looked at the desk surface. "I know something about that." She said nothing. Let him have the space. "I would still have prosecuted Pruitt," he said. "Whatever my father signed doesn't justify what Pruitt did with it." A long exhale. "I would like to understand exactly what happened," happened in 1808. Carver can research it, she said, a pause. Would you? He stopped. Would I, what? He looked up at her with the directness that was, she had come to understand, simply how he operated when something mattered enough to abandon the careful perimeter he maintained around himself. Would you be there when he explains it? When we go through what he finds? The question was so straightforward that it took her slightly off guard. Not because it was extraordinary she was present for everything, they both knew that, but because of the way he asked it. Not as a practical matter, as something specific, something chosen. Yes, she said. Of course. He nodded and went back to his papers. She went back to hers. And they sat in the study in the autumn afternoon, two people working at the same desk on the same problem with the easy, unself-conscious proximity of people who have stopped calculating the distance between them. It was Mrs. Elmore who said it first. She said it to Amelia, in the kitchen, on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September. With the blunt straightforwardness of a woman who had worked for the Whitaker family for 12 years and had decided that 12 years bought her certain privileges. You know he watches you, she said, without preamble, chopping carrots with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who could conduct a complicated conversation without slowing down. When you're not looking, when you're in the fields, or at the desk, or talking to Eli, she didn't look up. He watches you the way a man watches something he's afraid to believe is real. Amelia did not respond immediately. Mrs. Elmore, she said carefully. I'm not meddling, the housekeeper said, with the tone of a woman who absolutely was meddling and had no intention of stopping. I'm informing. There's a difference. A pause. He hasn't watched anything the way he watches you in the 2 years I've known him since he came back from the war. He came back, she set the knife down briefly, like someone had taken the lights out. Going through the motions. Doing what needed doing, but not, she picked up the knife again, not present. You understand? Body here. Everything else, somewhere he couldn't get back from. Amelia understood. I see it too, she said quietly. I know you do. That's my point. Mrs. Elmore finally looked up. I want to make sure you see it in yourself, too. What you've done here. What you've built here in 10 weeks that I couldn't get back in 2 years of decent meals and well-kept rooms. She held Amelia's gaze with the frank, uncomplicated directness of a person who had earned the right to speak plainly. He's coming back, and you're the reason. Amelia held the older woman's gaze and did not look away, because looking away would have been a kind of dishonesty, and she had run out of room for that. I know, she said. Mrs. Elmore nodded once, with the satisfaction of a woman whose point has been received, and went back to her carrots. Amelia went back to her mourning. But she carried the conversation with her in the same way she'd been carrying things all autumn carefully, like something that needed room to settle before it could be fully understood. It was 3 days later that the second piece of news arrived, and this one she hadn't anticipated. It came in a letter, addressed to her, not to Nathaniel, not to Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, but to Amelia Carter Whitaker, in a handwriting she didn't immediately recognize, with a Richmond return address. She opened it alone, in the kitchen before anyone else was up. It was from a woman named Helena Marsh, who identified herself as the widow of Captain Arthur Marsh of the 12th Virginia Infantry, and who wrote with the careful, precise grammar of someone who had drafted the letter many times before settling on this version. She had heard about Amelia, she wrote. She had heard through the particular network of military widows and soldiers' families that extended, invisible and persistent, across Virginia about the woman who had married Nathaniel Whitaker and who was, apparently, beginning to be known in a certain community as someone who could be trusted. She needed help with something that was not simple. Not financial, or not only financial. Her late husband had died at the same engagement where Thomas Carter had died. And in the months after, she had discovered that the pensions he owed to her by the federal government, the widow's pension for an officer's service, had not arrived. She had inquired. She had been told it was processing. She had inquired again 6 months later and been given a different answer by a different clerk who did not seem to know what the first clerk had said. She had inquired a third time and been directed to a federal office in Washington that had not responded. She was not the only one, she wrote. There were 7 women she knew personally, widows of officers from the same engagement who were in the same situation. No pensions, no explanation, no recourse they had been able to identify. She had written to Amelia because someone had told her that Amelia Carter Whitaker was a woman who found things that were hidden and understood what they meant. Amelia read the letter twice. Then she sat very still for a long moment with the autumn morning coming gray and cool through the kitchen window. Then she got up, made coffee, and sat back down with a piece of paper. She was still writing when Nathaniel came in. He stopped when he saw her. Registered the focused, forward-leaning quality of her attention, the papers on the table, the cup of coffee going cold beside her. "What's happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He read it. She watched him read it, the same way she'd watched him read Thomas's letter, looking for the moment of understanding. It came faster than she expected. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved back to the top of the letter and read a section again. 7 women, he said, that she knows of personally. There may be more. He set the letter down, looked at her with eyes that were doing several things at once, processing, calculating, and underneath both of those, something that was simply anger. Clean and quiet and absolute. Someone is holding those pensions. Someone or a process that has broken down badly enough to produce the same result. She picked up her pen. Either way, it needs to be documented before anything else. Names, dates, correspondence records. We need to know the full scope of it before we know what it is. He was quiet for a moment. This isn't our fight. She looked up at him. I know that, he said. I'm not saying we shouldn't. He stopped. Started again. I need to understand what you want to do. I want to write back to Helena Marsh and ask her to share her documentation. And to share ours, whatever channels you have access to through your military contacts, because federal pension claims need to go through specific offices, and an officer's referral carries more weight than a widow's letter. She held his gaze. This is going to take time, and it's going to irritate people with comfortable positions. I want to know if you're willing to let it irritate them. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Thomas's widow would have been in the same position, said quietly. If he'd been married. The thought landed between them with a weight that neither of them moved away from. Yes, she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Tell me what documentation you need, and I'll contact Colonel Harwick in Richmond. He owes me a considerable favor, and he knows every federal office within 200 miles. She felt something move through her that was warmer and more definite than anything she'd allowed herself to feel in the careful space of the last 10 weeks, and she pushed it aside and picked up her pen. Because there was work to do, and she needed her hands to be steady. Start with Harwick, she said. I'll draft the letter to Mrs. Marsh this morning. They worked for 2 hours. Side by side at the kitchen table, the way they'd worked at the study desk, the way they worked everywhere, with the unself-conscious efficiency of 2 people who have stopped negotiating space and simply occupy it together. She drafted letters. He added contacts, context, the specific language of military authority that opened doors that civilian correspondents couldn't reach. At some point, Mrs. Elmore arrived, looked at the 2 of them with the expression of a woman whose point has been proven more thoroughly than she'd intended, and began making breakfast around them without comment. It was Nathaniel who said it, not dramatically, not as a declaration. In the same quiet, direct way he said most things that mattered, with his eyes on the paper in front of him, and his voice pitched for her alone. I told you I wanted to talk to you about something, he said. That wasn't the farm. Her pen stopped moving, she said. A pause. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I've spent the better part of a year being someone who functions and nothing more, and I'm not. Another pause. I'm not practiced at saying what's actually happening." She set the pen down. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been learning all autumn, the one that was not armor and not performance, and not the controlled presentation of a man managing how he's perceived. Just him. Just what was actually there. "Then say it plainly," she said. "You know I prefer plain." A breath. Almost the laugh. "But more serious than that. I don't want this to be a debt anymore," he said. "What's between us? I don't want to think about Thomas's promise when I think about you, and I haven't, for some time. I think about you." He held her gaze with effort she could sense costing him something. "You specifically. What you'll say about a thing. Whether you'll be there when I come in from the field. Whether the letter you're writing at the kitchen table is something I should know about. A beat. I notice you the way I haven't noticed anything in a long time." Amelia looked at him in the autumn morning light with Mrs. Elmore conspicuously making a great deal of noise at the far end of the kitchen, and she thought about all the ledgers and surveys and letters and bad men and good ones, and she thought about Thomas, who had known exactly what he was doing. And she thought about the ember she had been carrying carefully since the parlor, and all the time she had almost fanned it and turned away. "I notice you too," she said, simply, without elaboration, because it was enough and they both knew it. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, not dramatically, not with the choreographed tenderness of a man performing feeling. Just his hand on hers, warm and present, entirely real. She turned her hand over and held his. Mrs. Elmore dropped a spoon. Neither of them looked up. Outside, September moved through Whitaker Farm in its slow, certain way, the fields changing, the creek running low, the tree line beginning to turn. And inside the kitchen, two people who had entered a contract and found something else entirely on the other side of it held each other's hand across a table covered in letters written on behalf of women who deserved better. And the world went on doing what it always did, indifferent and ordinary, and somehow also, in this specific moment, entirely sufficient. It was enough. It was in fact everything. The hand-holding lasted exactly 40 seconds before Amelia picked up her pen again. Not because the moment hadn't mattered. It had mattered enormously, in the specific way of things that settle, rather than explode, not a thunderclap, but a key turning in a lock that had been resistant for months. But there were 7 women in Virginia who hadn't received money the federal government owed them, and sentiment, however genuine, did not write letters. Nathaniel understood this. That was one of the things about him she had stopped being surprised by and started simply appreciating. He never asked her to be less than she was, in order to make a moment more comfortable. He picked up his own pen, and they went back to work, and the fact of what had just passed between them lived in the room without demanding any further performance. Mrs. Elmore made eggs and did not say a single word, which was the most eloquent thing the woman had done in 3 months. The letter to Helena Marsh went out that afternoon. Colonel Harwick in Richmond received Nathaniel's correspondence the following day. And the week after that, Amelia received a reply from Mrs. Marsh that was longer than the first letter, more detailed, and enclosed documentation from 4 of the 7 women pension applications filed, acknowledged, and then apparently absorbed into a silence that produced no payment and no explanation. She spread the documents across the study desk and looked at them for a long time. Then she said, "To the empty room," in the quiet voice she used for things that made her genuinely angry, "Someone is sitting on these." Nathaniel appeared in the doorway as if summoned. "What did you find?" "Look at the dates," she pointed. All 7 applications were filed within a 6-week window. All 7 were acknowledged by the same federal clerk, same signature, see it? And then nothing. No rejection. No correspondence. She looked up. You don't lose 7 applications from the same engagement by accident. This is not administrative failure. He crossed to the desk and looked at the dates. She watched his face. "Harwick needs to know about the signature," he said. Harwick needs to know about all of it. But Nathaniel, she turned to face him directly. This is going to go somewhere uncomfortable. If someone is deliberately holding these pensions, they're doing it because they have something to gain. That means money, or influence, or both. And when we start pulling at it, whoever is holding it is going to push back. I know, he said. I need you to know that I intend to pull at it regardless, she said. I want to be honest about that. If you'd rather... Amelia. His voice was patient and direct in equal measure. Stop offering me exits I'm not going to take. She looked at him. I'm in, he said. I was in when I sat down at the table this morning. I'm in because it's right, and because you're right, and because 7 women who are owed money by this government are not going to get it unless someone with enough standing to make noise does exactly that. He held her gaze. Make noise, I'll stand behind it. She held his gaze for a moment. Beside it, she said, a beat. Beside it, he agreed. She turned back to the documents. Then we need to build a case before we build a complaint. Complaints without documentation get lost. Documentation without complaints gets ignored. She began organizing the papers into order. I'm going to need 3 weeks. You have them, he said. She nodded and got to work. The 3 weeks were the most productive and the most dangerous of everything that had come before. Productive because Amelia was in her element, in a way that had nothing to do with social calculation or property management. This was pattern recognition, the deep, instinctive reading of numbers and records that she'd been doing since she was 16 years old, keeping her father's parish accounts, and she was very good at it. Within 10 days, she had charted every pension application she could access from the 1,812 engagement, cross-referenced the acknowledgement signatures, identified a secondary clerk signature that appeared only on approved applications, and mapped a clear documented divergence between the two. Dangerous because word got out. It always did. That was the particular vulnerability of a county that ran on conversation. You could not ask questions of 7 different women in 3 different parts of Virginia without someone noticing the questions had a shape. The shape was noticed by a man named Doyle Hatcher, who held a minor federal appointment in the district land office, and who arrived at Whitaker Farm on a Friday morning, the 3rd Friday of October, with the air already carrying real cold, with the specific energy of a man who has come to deliver a warning while making it look like a visit. He was pleasant. He had excellent boots, the practiced ease of a man accustomed to rooms where he was the most important person present. He shook Nathaniel's hand with the confidence of someone who had calculated that Nathaniel Whitaker, wealthy land owner and former officer, would understand a certain kind of message delivered between gentlemen. He had not calculated Amelia. She was in the study when he arrived, and she was in the parlor 12 minutes later when Nathaniel brought him through. Because she had heard the knock and made a message about where to be, with the efficiency of a woman who had learned that position mattered. Hatcher looked at her with the briefest possible recalibration and extended the pleasantness to cover her. Mrs. Whitaker. A pleasure, Mr. Hatcher, she said. I've been hoping someone from the district office would come. I have questions about the pension processing timeline for the 12th Virginia Infantry widows. She smiled at him with the full, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who has everything she needs already in writing. Perhaps you can help. Something shifted behind Hatcher's pleasant eyes. He spent the next 20 minutes demonstrating that he could not, in fact, help, not because he didn't know the answers, but because every answer she offered him a door toward. He stepped carefully around. He was skilled. She gave him that. He deflected without appearing to deflect, redirected without appearing to redirect, and maintained throughout the tone of a man who was doing his utmost to be cooperative with a woman who was unfortunately asking about things beyond her understanding. She let him finish. Then she placed 3 documents on the table between them. These are the original acknowledgement records from the district pension office, she said. This signature appears on all 7 unprocessed applications. This signature, she placed a second document, appears on the 6 applications from the same engagement that were processed and paid, but to veterans rather than widows. She placed the third document. These are the Federal Processing Guidelines for 1813, which specify that widows' pensions from an officer's service are to be processed within 90 days of application acknowledgement. These applications are 14 months past that deadline. Hatcher looked at the documents with the expression of a man who has just discovered the room he entered was not the room he thought it was. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully, "these records are accurate," she said. "I obtained them through the county clerk's office, which has access to the federal filing copies. All legally available, all properly documented." She folded her hands. "Mr. Hatcher, I want to be very direct with you. I have no interest in making anyone's life difficult for the pleasure of it. What I want is for 7 women to receive the money their government owes them. If there's a process for making that happen quickly and without further complexity, I am genuinely very open to hearing about it." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel sat in the chair to her left and said nothing, in the specific, deliberate way of a man who has decided that silence is his most powerful contribution. Hatcher looked at the documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Amelia with an expression that had shed the pleasant layer entirely. "You understand," he said quietly, "that pushing on this will create difficulties." "For whom?" she asked, a pause that answered the question without answering it. "I understand that some things are slow, because the process is slow," she said. "And I understand that some things are slow because someone finds it convenient for them to be slow. What I don't understand yet is which of those is true here." She held his gaze. "I intend to understand it, and once I do, I intend to share what I've understood with Colonel Harwick, who I believe has some interest in how this district office handles the affairs of officers who served under his command." Hatcher stood. "I'll look into the processing timeline," he said. The pleasantness was entirely gone. What remained was a man who had come to manage a problem and discovered the problem was significantly more organized than he'd anticipated. "I appreciate that," she said, "enormously." He left. Nathaniel waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he said, "Harwick actually does have interest in this." "I know," she said. "I wrote to him about the signature discrepancy last week." A pause. "You didn't tell me. I didn't want to worry you with something I wasn't sure of yet." She began gathering the documents into their folder. "I'm sure of it now." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as the intersection of exasperation and something that was decidedly not exasperation. "Amelia, we agreed on full information." She looked up. "We did. You're right, I should have told you. A beat. I'm telling you now. You're telling me after you've already deployed it in a meeting." It was more effective that way. He looked at her for a long moment. And then there it was, the laugh, short, involuntary, real. "You are the most." Shook his head. "Thomas warned me." She felt warmth move through her like a physical thing. "What did he warn you?" Nathaniel looked at her with eyes that held, simultaneously, grief and affection, and something that was beyond both of them, something that had no clean name. He said, and I am recalling this accurately, he said, "If you ever meet my sister, don't make the mistake of thinking she needs anything from you. She'll figure out what you have that's useful, and take it. Best thing you can do is try to keep up." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "That's the most accurate thing he ever said about me," she said. "I know," Nathaniel said. "I've been trying to keep up since July." She looked at him across the desk with the afternoon light falling thin and autumn gold through the window, and something she had been careful with all this time. Something she had turned over and examined and refused to rush. She let it be what it was. "You're keeping up," she said quietly, "for what it's worth." He held her gaze with those steady, dark eyes that she had spent 4 months learning, and was still learning, and he said, "It's worth a great deal." The Garrett Pruitt case concluded in the 3rd week of October. The county court found him guilty on 4 counts of fraudulent conversion of funds, which was the legal language for what Amelia would have called plain theft if she'd been asked. and sentenced him to restitution, plus a period of removal from the county, the specifics of which Carver explained in careful legal language that amounted to, he was done, and he knew it, and the farm was protected. Amelia received this news in the kitchen from Mrs. Elmore, who received it from the flower boy, who had heard it from the clerk who posted the ruling. She set down her cup. She breathed once. Then she went to find Nathaniel. He was in the east field, where the drainage project was now 3/4 complete and running along the timeline she'd calculated back in July. He was with Eli and 2 of the older workers, and he was doing what he did now with increasing regularity, actually working. Not supervising from a position of comfortable distance, but in it with his coat off and his sleeves up and his hands in the business of the thing. She walked out to where he was and she said, "It's done. The court ruled this morning." He looked at her. She could see the weight of it releasing from him, not dramatically, not with any visible display, but in the way his shoulders changed, just slightly, as if something he'd been carrying very carefully could finally be set down. "Restitution," he said, "full, plus the county assessment." He nodded once. Then he looked out over the east field, the drainage lines running clean and true, the land that his father had started to save, and he was finishing, and he said quietly, "My father would have been embarrassed." "About Pruitt. Your father was ill and someone used it against him," she said. "That's not embarrassment. That's being human." He looked at her sideways. "You are very good at not letting me punish myself for things I can't change." "Someone has to be," she said. "You're not efficient at it on your own." He made the sound that was almost a laugh and turned back to the field. "The east drainage will be done by November," he said. 10 days ahead of schedule, she agreed. "Because of the 1,807 records you found. Because of the work your father started." He looked at her again. "Amelia, accept the credit." She tilted her head. "We found it together." A pause. "I'm starting to think the word together means something different in practice than it does in theory." "What does it mean in practice?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "It means I'm better at almost everything than I was 4 months ago, and the only variable that changed was you." She absorbed this. "The only variable that changed," she said carefully, "was that you started looking at what was already yours." He held her gaze. "Including you?" The question sat between them in the cool October air, direct and uncomplicated, and the most honest thing either of them had said in a month of very honest things. "I'm not something you own," she said. "But yes, including me." He reached out and took her hand. Not the way he had at the kitchen table, tentative, still partly uncertain. With intention. With the specific commitment of a man who has made a decision and intends it to be permanent. "Good," he said. Eli, to his eternal credit, became very interested in the drainage pipe 3 yards away. The pension case broke open in November. Harwick's involvement proved exactly as effective as Amelia had calculated a colonel's formal inquiry to the federal district office produced. Within 2 weeks, a response that would not have come in 2 years of widows' correspondence. What it produced was, at first, a series of procedural explanations that Amelia recognized immediately as the administrative equivalent of the wall Pruitt had built in the ledgers, technically coherent, emotionally reasonable, and upon examination deeply insufficient. She wrote back to each explanation with documentation. 3 times. She wrote back 3 times, each lecture more precise than the last. Each one narrowing the space available from brick discs drawn with the methodical patience of a woman who had been reading the difference between what people said and what they meant since she was old enough to keep accounts. The 3rd letter produced a name. A clerk named Samuel Ott, Junior District Administrator, who had been responsible for processing the 12th Infantry widow applications, and who had, according to internal records Harwick's inquiry had finally unlocked, transferred the files to a secondary holding category in March of 1814 under the notation, "Pending secondary verification officer status disputed." Officer status disputed. Amelia read those 3 words and felt a cold clarity settle over her. They disputed the officers' ranks posthumously, she told Nathaniel that evening. All 7 of the women whose husbands died in the same engagement. Someone filed a status query on each of their commissions after their deaths, which triggered a procedural hold on the pensions while the commissions were in theory under review. He was very still. In theory, the commissions were never actually in dispute. The query was filed by a single clerk, without supporting documentation, and appears to have been forgotten or ignored by everyone except the pension processing system, which obediently put all 7 applications on hold and kept them there. She looked at him. I don't know yet whether Ott did this deliberately or through incompetence. Both are possible. The outcome is identical. Who else is involved? I don't know. Hatcher knew something. His reaction when I showed him the documents was not the reaction of a man encountering new information. But knowing something and doing something are different levels of involvement. She set the papers down. This needs to go to Harwick with a formal recommendation for a federal inquiry. Not a district inquiry. Federal. District inquiries investigate district problems. This has a shape that suggests the district is the problem. He looked at her across the desk. You know what that means. It means Hatcher will know it was us within a week of the filing. And he will not be pleased. No, she won't. She held Nathaniel's gaze. I need you to decide if you're willing to have Doyle Hatcher actively displeased with the Whitaker name. Nathaniel leaned forward. Write the letter to Harwick. Tonight. Amelia. His voice was quiet and absolute. 7 women have been waiting over a year for money that is owed to them. Their husbands died in the same battle where Thomas died. If Thomas had been married, breathed once. Write the letter. She picked up her pen. The federal inquiry was opened in December. It moved with the particular pace of federal processes, slower than she would have chosen, faster than she'd feared, and it produced results in the early months of 1816 that were simultaneously satisfying and sobering. Samuel Ott was found to have negligently mishandled the processing holds, and while the investigation could not establish deliberate fraud, it established sufficient procedural failure to mandate his removal and the immediate processing of all 7 pension applications. The first payment reached Helena Marsh on a Tuesday in February. She wrote to Amelia the same day. The letter was not long. It did not need to be. I did not know your name 4 months ago, she wrote. I do not have the words for what you have done, except to say that I will carry it for the rest of my life, and I will tell my children. Thank you. That is insufficient. I am saying it anyway. Amelia read the letter at the kitchen table, with her coffee going cold beside her. She folded it carefully and placed it in the back of the study ledger, not the original one, not the one where Thomas had left his letter, but the new one she'd started in September when she began keeping the farm's records in the organized, indexed system that Nathaniel had said with characteristic directness was the best administrative decision anyone had made at Whitaker Farm in 15 years. She put the letter there because it was the kind of document that deserved to be kept carefully. The kind that told you, plainly, what the work had been for. Mrs. Elmore found her there and did not say anything and put fresh coffee in front of her and left again. Amelia sat with the coffee and the ledger and the particular, complicated, full feeling of a thing pleaded, and she let herself have it without qualification or redirect. She had earned it. On a Saturday in March of 1816, something happened that had not been planned and could not have been engineered, and that Amelia would, for the rest of her life. Consider the moment when the last weight she hadn't known she was still carrying finally came down. It was not dramatic in its external form. That was the thing about the real ones, they almost never were. She was in the barn with Eli, checking the new foal that had arrived 2 days earlier and was still finding its legs with the endearing, indignant determination of something that has been promised the world and is irritated to find it requires practice. The morning was cold. Her breath showed. She was wearing a coat that had been Nathaniel's and was too large and warm, and she had stopped pretending she wore it for any reason other than that she wanted to. Nathaniel came in from outside. He stopped in the barn door. He looked at her in his coat, with hay on her boots, talking to Eli about the foal's front left leg with the focused, practical attention she brought to everything, and he said, to no one in particular, Thomas. Just the name. Not sad. Something else. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she knew better than any other, the one that was not armor, not performance, just him. But there was something new in it this morning, something that had arrived quietly and made itself at home. What? She said. He said, Nathaniel told her. In one of the last conversations we had before that engagement, he said, if anything happens to me, I don't want Amelia mourning. She doesn't have time for it, and she'd be terrible at it. What I want is for her to be somewhere she can do what she does. He paused. I've been thinking about that for a week. She was quiet. I think, Nathaniel said carefully, that he knew, even then, that this is where you'd end up. Not this barn specifically, but he paused. Somewhere like this. Somewhere that needed what you have. She crossed the barn to him. She stood in front of him, and she looked up at him in the cold March morning, and she said he did know. That was Thomas. He always knew before anyone else did. Her voice was steady. He knew you too. Better than you knew yourself, I think. Nathaniel reached up and tucked a piece of hair back from her face with the simple natural movement of a man who has stopped calculating whether he's permitted and simply acts from the truth of what he feels. I love you, he said, plainly, the way he said the things that mattered most. I want you to know that clearly and without any of the context it arrived in. Not as a promise to Thomas, not as what this arrangement became. As what it is. You, he held her gaze, I love you. Amelia looked at him for a long, full moment. I know, she said. He waited. I love you too, she said. I have for some time. I was waiting until I was certain you wouldn't receive it as a complication. He looked at her with an expression that was exasperated and warm and entirely undone. A complication. You had a great deal happening. Amelia, Nathaniel, you could have told me in September. She considered this seriously. Probably October. You had the Pruitt case. You managed the Pruitt case. We managed the Pruitt case. He pulled her in and held her with the full, straightforward commitment of a man who has decided and intends it to stand, and she let him, and she held him back. And Eli made a sound in the corner that suggested he had found something extremely interesting to look at in the far stall. She laughed. Against his shoulder, quiet, real, and he laughed too. The full one, the unguarded one that she had heard for the first time in a kitchen in September, and had been holding in her memory since. And the barn was warm from the animals and cold from the morning, and entirely ordinary, and it was perfect. It was enough. It was everything. It was the thing Thomas had seen before either of them could. 3 years later, when people in Hargrove County talked about Whitaker Farm, and they did talk about it, because it had become a particular kind of story that counties return to when they need reminding what's possible, they talked about the east drainage that made the land profitable, and the pension case that Colonel Harwick credited in writing to the Whitakers' intervention, and the small school that Amelia established on the farm's southern edge in the spring of 1817, where the children of farm workers could learn to read and keep accounts and understand what their labor was worth. They talked about Nathaniel Whitaker, who had come back from the War Hollow and found his way back to himself through the uncompromising, practical, enormous generosity of a woman who had refused to let him stay lost. And they talked, in the particular way that stories survive when they're worth surviving, about the minister's daughter who had walked 3 miles in summer heat to marry a man who owed her brother a debt and who had spent the years that followed building something so real and so durable that the debt became an irrelevance and the obligation became a life. Amelia Carter Whitaker never described herself as someone who had been rescued. She described herself, when pressed, as someone who had arrived at the right place, at the right time with the right set of skills, and had simply done what needed doing. Nathaniel, who was always present when she said this, would look at her with those steady dark eyes and say nothing, because there were no words adequate to the thing she was, and he had long since stopped trying to find them. He simply stayed beside her, and that, in the end, was the whole of it. Not a rescue, not a transaction, not the working out of a dead man's last request, but two people who had found in each other what neither had known to look for, and had chosen it, plainly and without ceremony, every single day. That was the truth of it. That was what Thomas Carter had seen from the beginning, and had trusted them to find, and had been right about. He was almost always right about the things that mattered. They made sure his name was on the school.